Buried beneath the official records of the Second World War lies a labyrinth of forgotten files, sealed orders, and erased testimonies. For decades, these fragments were locked away in vaults labeled with the words "restricted access," concealed not only from the public, but from generations of historians trained to believe in a singular narrative of good and evil. Yet when cross-referenced with scattered memoranda, intercepted cables, and faded field reports, a darker mosaic begins to emerge. It is a picture of fragile alliances built on expediency, of rival ideologies momentarily intertwined, of betrayals written in invisible ink and then quietly buried under rubble. Warsaw, Narvik, Wall Street, and the banks of the Vistula. These names reappear like echoes across classified correspondence, carrying with them not only the weight of military campaigns, but the moral compromises that decided the fate of millions. The truths that surface here are not convenient victories nor simple tales of liberation. They are forbidden histories, forged in whispered meetings between sworn enemies, in sealed freight wagons disappearing into occupied territories, in boardrooms where profit outweighed patriotism. Each hidden chapter was deliberately obscured by those with power to control memory itself. What follows is not conjecture, but a reconstruction from the very words of the generals, ministers, and agents who played roles they never intended to see the light of day. These are not stories that comfort. They are revelations that disturb, challenge, and unravel the myths we were taught to accept as history. Chapter 1. The Secret Pact. Beneath Warsaw, the September of 1939 is remembered for the sudden collapse of Poland, a nation squeezed to death by two giants converging from east and west. Yet buried deep within Soviet and German archives lies evidence that their cooperation extended far beyond the publicized Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Documents, stamped Directive Vostok 12, reveal that in occupied Warsaw, where the city lay in ruins from weeks of relentless bombardment, representatives of the NKVD and Gestapo met in discreet gatherings to coordinate the dismantling of Polish resistance. The meetings were not recorded in official minutes, but appear in fragments across captured telegrams, intelligence notes, and interrogation records later recovered by the Allies. It was here, in the heart of a conquered capital, that ideological enemies acted not as adversaries but as partners, carving up the very soul of Poland in a pact unacknowledged for decades. The atmosphere of Warsaw in October 1939 was heavy with smoke, silence, and surveillance. German troops had paraded through its boulevards, but Soviet agents slipped in quietly through back channels, escorted by secret police in civilian clothes. According to OSS microfilm recovered in 1946, the first such meeting took place in a confiscated government building on Aleje Ujazdowski, a street once lined with embassies. The NKVD delegation, led by Commissar Grigory Litvinov, carried sealed orders signed by Lavrenti Beria himself. The German side, represented by SS Obersturmbannführer Herbert Mailhorn, brought prisoner manifests and intelligence maps marking known Polish underground safehouses. Their task was chillingly pragmatic: ensure that both powers neutralized threats simultaneously so that neither insurgency nor exiled government could regroup under protection of the other. The files described the process in clinical terms, but the consequences were catastrophic. Polish officers, judges, clergy, and intellectuals were placed on overlapping lists marked to be liquidated. In one intercepted NKVD memorandum, reference is made to synchronizing the removal of subversives across occupied zones. Gestapo file number 17 confirms that Berlin shared interrogation protocols and interrogation results with their Soviet counterparts, a grotesque exchange of methodology between two systems renowned for cruelty. Entire resistance cells found themselves betrayed on both fronts, captured while attempting to cross from German to Soviet territory or vice versa. Survivors would later testify, under oath at Nuremberg and in Soviet trials, that their names had appeared on lists in both camps, evidence of coordination that could not have occurred by chance. By spring 1940, the scale of this cooperation reached its darkest climax in the forests near Smolensk. The Katyn massacre, long denied by Moscow and attributed falsely to the Nazis, bore the hallmarks of planning that extended back to those Warsaw meetings. NKVD documentation links the liquidation of Polish officers to earlier intelligence exchanges, suggesting the Germans were at least aware, if not complicit, in the systematic extermination of Poland's elite. Western diplomats received whispers of these events, Yet wartime necessity demanded silence. Britain and the United States needed the Soviet Union as an ally after 1941, and any revelation of such collusion would fracture the alliance before the defeat of Hitler. Thus, the truth was filed away, sealed under layers of classification, labeled as politically sensitive. Witness accounts collected by underground couriers give human texture to these cold documents. Resistance leader Jan Karski, who risked his life carrying reports to London, described uncanny disappearances. Commanders arrested by the Germans in Krakow while their counterparts vanished, simultaneously under Soviet custody in Lviv. He could not explain how both occupiers struck at the same networks with such precision until decades later, when surviving files confirmed what had long been whispered, that Warsaw's first great betrayal was not by one enemy, but by two in concert. The meetings themselves were shrouded in secrecy, but visual fragments remain. A confiscated Gestapo map marks the site of one gathering with a simple black triangle labeled Besprechung. Soviet documents reference Sector 7, Building 11 in Warsaw, believed to be the same location. Weather reports from October 1939 describe heavy autumn rains, masking the sound of footsteps as convoys arrived under cover of night. Curtains drawn, lamps dimmed, guards posted outside. The trappings of a conspiracy between men who would soon enough claim to be mortal enemies. The few who witnessed these gatherings were silenced, either through execution or by exile to the gulags. Their names reappear only in marginal notes on NKVD rosters, scribbled in faded ink that time nearly erased. When the files surfaced decades later, first in fragmented Soviet disclosures during the Glasnost era, and later in declassified OSS records, the pattern was undeniable. The supposed ideological abyss between Hitler and Stalin had, for a brief but decisive period, narrowed into collaboration. It was not born of friendship, but of expedience, a shared objective to crush Poland so thoroughly that no phoenix could rise from its ashes. The pact beneath Warsaw ensured that resistance would be strangled before it matured, that voices of leadership would be silenced before they could speak for the nation. What remained was a population left leaderless, forced underground, and betrayed at every turn. The story of this hidden pact is not merely one of collaboration, but of erasure. Histories written in both East and West omitted it, not by accident, but by deliberate choice. For Moscow, admitting cooperation with the Gestapo would shatter the mythology of anti-fascist struggle. For the West, acknowledging that the Soviet ally had once conspired with Hitler's enforcers would threaten the fragile unity of the post-war order. Thus, the truth was buried in sealed envelopes, stamped with red wax, stored in archives whose access required signatures from men who understood the price of revelation. Only when the Cold War began to thaw did fragments escape into public view, pieced together by historians who stumbled upon references in unrelated files, a ghostly paper trail that refused to remain silent. The ruins of Warsaw bear no plaque for these meetings. The buildings where NKVD and Gestapo agents once sat face to face have been rebuilt, their facades clean, their past erased from official memory. Yet within the yellowed pages of classified documents, the shadows of those nights remain. Names crossed out, words blacked with ink, maps marked with faint symbols. These are the remnants of a conspiracy denied by all parties, but written in the language of bureaucracy, impossible to invent, impossible to ignore. The pact beneath Warsaw was real, and its consequences shaped not only the fate of Poland, but the trajectory of the entire war. This is the story that should never have surfaced. It is the record of a betrayal so profound that both perpetrators sought to erase it, and both allies of convenience and enemies of necessity colluded in silence. For the people of Poland, it was not a hidden file, but a living nightmare, endured in prisons, forests, and execution grounds. For the rest of the world, it was a truth too dangerous to confront. But history has a way of unearthing what was meant to stay buried, and the whispers from those October nights in Warsaw continue to echo, long after the last witness fell silent. Chapter 2. Churchill's abandoned invasion of Norway in the cold northern waters of early 1940. As Europe stood on the brink of total war, Britain's war cabinet authorized a daring but desperate gamble. The plan, known within Admiralty papers as Operation Catherine, aimed to sever Nazi Germany's lifeline of iron ore transported from Sweden through the Norwegian port of Narvik. The proposal bore Winston Churchill's unmistakable imprint. As First Lord of the Admiralty, he believed that crippling German access to ore would cripple the Wehrmacht itself. Declassified memoranda labeled Admiralty File X-74 reveal a chillingly detailed blueprint. Outdated battleships, stripped and reinforced with crude armor plating, were to be converted into floating fortresses capable of withstanding coastal defenses while raiding shipping lanes. Churchill insisted that Britain must act decisively before Hitler entrenched himself in Scandinavia. Yet the plan never reached fruition, derailed by delays, political hesitation, and most fatally, by German intelligence intercepts that exposed the timetable. By March 1940, the strategic importance of Norway had become undeniable. Germany imported nearly 10 million tons of Swedish iron ore annually, most of it passing through Narvik during the winter months when the Baltic ports froze. Without this steady flow, the German armaments industry would falter. Churchill's plan was audacious, but not without precedent. The Royal Navy had a long tradition of bold raids into hostile waters. However, as documents later uncovered in German archives demonstrate, the Abwehr had infiltrated British communications and was already aware of northern operations under discussion. Reports filed by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris warned Hitler of possible Allied incursions, and in response, Berlin accelerated preparations for its own preemptive strike, Operation Weserübung, the German invasion of Denmark and Norway. Churchill's vision of Operation Catherine involved a level of improvisation bordering on desperation. The converted ships were to be manned by crews operating under extreme conditions, with limited escort support and inadequate air cover. Admiralty memoranda described the vessels as heavily plated with cement and steel reinforcement, but naval engineers privately questioned whether such modifications would withstand even moderate shell fire. Still, Churchill pushed forward, arguing in cabinet sessions recorded in War Minutes 1240 that the risk of inaction outweighed the risk of loss. He was haunted by the prospect of a drawn-out war in which Germany's industrial might, fueled by Scandinavian ore, would grind Britain into submission. His gamble, though reckless, carried a brutal logic. The German invasion of Norway in April 1940 exposed the fragility of Britain's preparations. Operation Weserübung was executed with speed and precision, seizing key ports and airfields before the Royal Navy could intervene effectively. Declassified German naval reports confirm that British hesitation allowed the Wehrmacht to secure vital strongholds with minimal resistance. By the time Churchill's improvised flotilla was ready, Narvik was already under German control. Defended by mountain troops of the 3rd Gebirgsjäger Division and Luftwaffe squadrons stationed on hastily captured airstrips, British naval forces clashed with German destroyers in the fjords, but the larger objective of strangling Germany's ore supply was already lost. The political fallout was immediate. The failure to prevent Germany's occupation of Norway fueled a crisis of confidence in Neville Chamberlain's government, leading to his resignation in May 1940. Churchill, though partially responsible for the fiasco, emerged paradoxically stronger, ascending to the premiership as Britain faced its darkest hour. Official communiques at the time referred only to northern engagements, carefully omitting the scale of Britain's failed gamble. Yet minutes from closed cabinet sessions, sealed until decades later, reveal that ministers were acutely aware of how close the operation had come to altering the course of the war. Had Narvik been secured by Britain first, Hitler's blitzkrieg might have been deprived of the steel that fueled its armoured thrust into France. The suppressed details of Operation Catherine expose not only strategic miscalculation but also the fragility of Allied intelligence. Intercepts from Bletchley Park were still in their infancy, unable to provide the clarity that might have preempted German moves. Meanwhile, British diplomatic efforts in Oslo faltered as Norway remained publicly committed to neutrality even as German troops massed across the border. Reports from the British legation, filed under Oslo Dispatches March 1940, warned of suspicious German shipping activity, but were drowned out by the cabinet's internal divisions. The war cabinet feared provoking neutral countries, yet Churchill argued that neutrality in a world consumed by Hitler's aggression was itself a dangerous illusion. Survivor accounts from sailors involved in the Norwegian campaign add haunting texture to the cold language of memoranda. Lieutenant Commander David Howarth, who later documented his experience, described the fjords lit by burning oil tankers, the air thick with smoke, and the echo of distant artillery. Men fought not for victory, but for survival, their mission undermined before it had even begun. Admiralty records confirm that over 20 British warships were damaged or lost in the campaign, a devastating toll for an objective that was never achieved. German documents captured after the war show how close Britain came to success. Had the invasion been launched even 2 weeks earlier, Narvik could have been secured without significant resistance. In retrospect, the abandoned invasion of Norway stands as both a failure and a turning point. It revealed the dangers of indecision, the price of secrecy, and the ruthless efficiency of German intelligence. It also underscored Churchill's willingness to embrace high-risk strategies, a trait that would define his leadership throughout the war. The suppressed files of Operation Catherine remain a testament to a moment when victory was within reach, but lost to hesitation and betrayal. Britain's most daring gamble of 1940 never materialized, leaving behind only fragments of plans, sealed orders, and the silence of men who knew that history would never record the truth of their mission. For decades, the official narrative spoke only of Northern Waters engagements and the Norwegian campaign, avoiding any mention of Churchill's audacious plan. It was safer to frame the operation as a defensive response to German aggression, rather than a failed attempt at preemption. Yet the declassified archives tell a darker story, one of ambition, intelligence failure, and the tragic irony that Britain's boldest move might have averted catastrophe had it been executed in time. Operation Catherine is remembered today not as a triumph, but as a ghost, a forbidden chapter of the war in which secrecy and miscalculation sealed the fate of a nation and cost Britain dearly in blood and steel. Chapter 3. America's shadow deal with the Reich amid the thunder of artillery and the banners of total war. Another war was being waged in silence. One fought not on battlefields but in boardrooms, on balance sheets, and through coded telegrams passed between banks in Stockholm and Zurich. The story is buried within the vaults of the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the CIA, where sealed dossiers marked Operation Safe Haven detail a grim paradox. While American soldiers stormed beaches and bled in the deserts of North Africa, elements of American industry were quietly sustaining the very enemy they sought to destroy. Decrypted cables, corporate memoranda, and testimony gathered from post-war tribunals reveal a forbidden network of transactions that allowed Nazi Germany to continue procuring critical supplies long after sanctions and embargoes were in place. This is not the narrative of unity taught in schools, but a suppressed truth where profit eclipsed patriotism, and where the engines of war were greased by hands that should have stood idle. The evidence begins with tungsten, the hard metal essential to armor-piercing shells and precision machinery. Officially, the United States embargoed trade with Germany after 1941. Unofficially, shipments continued to reach the Reich through neutral countries such as Spain and Portugal, facilitated by American intermediaries. OSS documents marked Vault 9 tungsten supply routes trace the flow of material from South American mines, purchased by subsidiaries of US corporations, then redirected through Lisbon into German stockpiles. These operations were masked behind layers of shell companies, with Swiss bankers ensuring that no trail led directly back to Wall Street. Intercepted communications between the German War Ministry and intermediaries in Madrid, decrypted by Allied cryptographers in 1944, confirmed that these shipments extended the Reich's ability to sustain high-intensity warfare on the Eastern Front. The role of IBM stands as one of the most haunting examples. Their punch card systems, marketed through a German subsidiary known as Die Homag, were used by the Nazi regime to conduct census operations, track resources, and, most chillingly, manage the logistics of the concentration camps. Trial records from Nuremberg, particularly those found in Industrial Case Number 9, include testimony from camp administrators describing how the efficiency of deportation trains depended on punch card tabulations. Though IBM's American leadership later claimed ignorance, financial records declassified in the 1990s demonstrate that royalty payments continued to flow from Berlin to New York even during the height of the war. In this shadow economy, human suffering was reduced to rows of numbers and profit margins, invisible behind the walls of corporate distance. Oil additives and synthetic rubber formed another channel of cooperation. German industry relied heavily on tetraethyl lead, a compound critical to high-octane aviation fuel. Documents retrieved from the archives of Standard Oil detail clandestine agreements with IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate that would later be infamous for producing Zyklon B. These agreements, some signed as late as 1941, ensured that technical knowledge flowed across the Atlantic, even as Germany bombed London and prepared for Operation Barbarossa. In exchange, Patents and technologies were shared discreetly, concealed under licensing arrangements routed through Switzerland. The result was a grotesque entanglement. The Luftwaffe's planes, which rained destruction on Allied cities, may have been fueled in part by American chemical expertise. The OSS investigation into these shadow dealings, launched in 1944 under the codename Operation Safe Haven, sought to expose and seize Nazi assets hidden in neutral countries. Reports filed by Alan Dulles, then OSS station chief in Bern, reveal frustration at the obstruction faced when probing accounts tied to powerful American firms. In one memo dated December 1944, Dulles wrote, "The greatest barrier to pursuit of German funds is not lack of intelligence, but the reluctance of certain Allied interests to proceed." The sanitized versions of these reports, sent to Washington, omitted the names of corporations and banks involved. Only the uncensored originals, discovered decades later, reveal the scale of the complicity. Neutral Sweden with its iron ore shipments, Switzerland with its gold laundering operations, and even Argentina with its shipping companies, all served as conduits for a hidden war economy in which American fingerprints were present but carefully smudged. Perhaps most damning is the evidence of continuity after the war. Many of the corporations implicated in Safe Haven's investigations emerged unscathed, protected by political expediency and the looming threat of the Cold War. IG Farben executives were tried at Nuremberg, yet numerous American partners avoided scrutiny. Instead, these same firms received contracts under the Marshall Plan, tasked with rebuilding the very Europe their dealings had helped devastate. Declassified Treasury records show heated debates between officials like Henry Morgenthau, who pushed for accountability, and others who feared economic instability if powerful corporations were exposed. In the end, pragmatism triumphed over justice, and the files were buried under classifications that lasted more than 40 years. The human cost of these shadow transactions is measured not in dollars, but in lives prolonged under tyranny. Every additional shipment of tungsten meant more German shells piercing Allied armor. Every barrel of aviation fuel blended with American chemical knowledge meant more Allied bombers lost to Luftwaffe fighters. Every punched card tabulated by IBM's machines meant deportation trains ran with lethal precision, filling the camps faster than human clerks could have managed. Survivors of Buchenwald and Auschwitz, testifying decades later, described trains that never ceased to arrive, always on time. Unbeknownst to them, the rhythm of that arrival was kept by machines built across the Atlantic. The secrecy surrounding America's shadow dealings with the Reich was not born solely of shame, but of necessity. In 1945, with the Soviet Union emerging as the next adversary, the United States could not afford to fracture its industrial base with public trials of corporate leaders. Files that might have destroyed reputations and reshaped economic power were quietly sealed, labeled, classified, national interest. The Cold War required strength, and strength required industry. Thus, the sins of war were buried beneath the snow of realpolitik, their whispers surviving only in the archives of those few investigators who dared to commit uncomfortable truths to paper. When fragments of Operation Safe Haven's records finally reached the public decades later, they were often dismissed as exaggerations or conspiracy. Yet the consistency of the evidence across intercepted cables, bank ledgers, trial transcripts, and OSS memoranda leaves little room for doubt. The war economy of the Third Reich was not an isolated machine, but one connected by hidden arteries to neutral capitals and, by extension, to corporations whose headquarters stood thousands of miles from the front. This reality, long concealed, reveals that World War II was not only fought in trenches and skies, but in the shadows of financial networks where allegiances blurred and morality dissolved into profit. The shadow deal with the Reich is not a tale of treason in the traditional sense. It is more insidious, a story of individuals and institutions that chose to prioritize survival, influence, and wealth over absolute loyalty to their nation. In their calculation, the war was temporary, but markets were eternal. What they did not foresee was that their silence, their complicity, and their transactions would be remembered, resurrected from the pages of forgotten files, and revealed as one of the darkest chapters in the hidden history of the Second World War. Chapter 4: The Soviet Betrayal of Warsaw. Uprising. In the sweltering heat of August 1944, the city of Warsaw erupted in defiance. After nearly 5 years of brutal occupation, the Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, launched an uprising intended to liberate the capital before the Red Army arrived. For 63 days, men and women armed with little more than homemade grenades and stolen rifles fought against the full might of the Wehrmacht and SS divisions. What they did not know, what could not be admitted in official histories for decades, was that their greatest enemy was not only the Germans, but also the silence of the Soviet forces waiting just across the Vistula River. Declassified Stavka orders, labeled strictly secret, File 482B, reveal the truth. Joseph Stalin had explicitly instructed his commanders to halt, to allow the uprising to bleed itself dry, to ensure that a non-communist resistance would not stand in the way of Soviet domination after the war. The geography of betrayal was cruelly simple. On the eastern bank of the Vistula, Soviet forces under Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky had driven the Wehrmacht into retreat. They stood within artillery range of Warsaw, their tanks and infantry capable of crossing the river within days. Yet on 1st August 1944, when the uprising began, the Red Army stopped. Soviet communique described logistical delays, exhaustion of supplies, and the need to regroup. But Stavka File 482B, discovered in the early 1990s, leaves no doubt. Stalin considered the Armia Krajowa politically hostile elements aligned with the Polish government in exile in London. To support them would be to strengthen a future rival to Soviet control. Thus, the Red Army watched as Warsaw burned. The Home Army, numbering nearly 40,000 fighters at the outset, expected Soviet support within days. Messages transmitted to London and intercepted by the OSS describe frantic pleas for aid. "We see Soviet patrols on the far bank. Why do they not cross?" Supplies were scarce. Ammunition ran dry. Civilians converted basements into makeshift hospitals as German Stukas rained bombs across entire districts. Still, the uprising held on, driven by desperation and hope. On the ground, Polish fighters reported hearing Soviet artillery fire in the distance, proof that the Red Army was active, but the guns never fired to aid Warsaw itself. Instead, Stalin allowed German reinforcements, including the notorious Derlewanger Brigade, to enter the city and crush the resistance with unparalleled brutality. British and American efforts to intervene faced obstacles at every turn. Declassified RAF records, marked Air Ministry Operation File 2047, detail how Allied planes attempted to drop supplies over Warsaw. Without Soviet airfields for refueling, the missions were forced to fly from Italy, a journey so long that many planes never returned. Stalin repeatedly refused requests to allow Western aircraft to land on Soviet-controlled territory, dismissing them as unnecessary provocations. Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill pressed Moscow, sending telegrams imploring Soviet cooperation. Stalin's replies, preserved in Foreign Office files, were evasive, citing military necessity and strategic priorities. The truth was concealed behind diplomatic language, but the intent was unmistakable. Stalin would not risk empowering a free Poland when a Soviet-controlled one was within reach. German forces, meanwhile, enacted a campaign of annihilation. SS General Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski oversaw operations to exterminate both fighters and civilians. Entire districts such as Wola and Ochota were massacred, tens of thousands executed in a matter of days. Testimonies gathered in post-war Polish trials describe machine guns mowing down columns of women and children, while flamethrowers reduced homes and hospitals to ash. The destruction of Warsaw was systematic, street by street, block by block, until little remained but ruins. By October 1944, the uprising was extinguished, its fighters dead, captured, or forced into hiding. Civilian casualties exceeded 150,000, making it one of the bloodiest urban insurrections of the war. Soviet propaganda of the time painted a different picture. Pravda described the uprising as ill-timed and adventurous, blaming the London-based Polish leadership for sacrificing lives recklessly. Yet internal Soviet reports uncovered after 1991 reveal that the pause along the Vistula was deliberate. Marshal Georgy Zhukov himself noted in a private memorandum that the destruction of hostile Polish formations serves our long-term strategic objectives. The betrayal was not a consequence of oversight or exhaustion, but a calculated act of political murder. By refusing to aid Warsaw, Stalin ensured that when the Red Army finally entered the city in January 1945, they encountered no independent resistance, only ruins ready to be rebuilt under communist rule. Survivors of the uprising carried the memory of abandonment for the rest of their lives. Diaries smuggled out of Warsaw describe the bitter realization: we are dying not only because of German bullets, but because of Soviet silence. Reports sent by underground couriers to London warned that morale was collapsing, that fighters were beginning to see the Soviets as co-conspirators in their destruction. In exile, the Polish government pressed the Allies to confront Stalin, but wartime necessity silenced them. Britain and the United States could not afford to rupture the Grand Alliance before Hitler was defeated. Thus, the truth of Soviet betrayal was buried beneath communiques of unity, hidden behind carefully worded declarations of solidarity. When the Red Army finally entered Warsaw in January 1945, the city was a graveyard. Out of a pre-war population of 1.3 million, less than 150,000 remained. The streets were unrecognizable, landmarks reduced to rubble, neighborhoods erased. Soviet cameras filmed their entry, portraying themselves as liberators of a devastated city. But those who had survived knew otherwise. Liberation had been withheld until resistance was extinguished. For decades, under communist rule, the uprising was censored or recast as a reckless adventure. Official histories omitted the scale of Soviet inaction, portraying the Red Army as victims of circumstance rather than orchestrators of betrayal. The opening of Soviet archives after the collapse of the USSR finally revealed the truth long whispered in exile. Stavka File 482B, coupled with internal memoranda from the NKVD, confirmed Stalin's direct order to halt. Polish historians who gained access to these files in the 1990s described them as the smoking gun, proof that the Soviet betrayal was not conjecture, but documented policy. The revelation deepened the wound in Polish memory, a reminder that their struggle for independence was not merely suppressed by enemies, but also sacrificed by supposed allies. The Soviet betrayal of the Warsaw Uprising remains one of the most haunting chapters of the war. It was not a tactical failure, but a deliberate act of geopolitical calculation, in which the lives of tens of thousands were deemed expendable for the sake of post-war control. It revealed the brutal logic of power, where the defeat of one tyrant was manipulated to secure the dominance of another. In the silence of the Red Army, in the unanswered pleas of Polish fighters, in the smoke that rose from the ruins of Warsaw, lies a truth long hidden from official history, that the city was allowed to die, not because it could not be saved, but because its survival was never desired. In every war, history is written not only by the victors, but also by those who choose what must remain hidden. The files we have uncovered, the secret pact in Warsaw, Churchill's abandoned strike in Norway, the shadow economy that fueled the Reich, and the Soviet betrayal of the Warsaw Uprising, reveal not a war of clear heroes and villains, but a labyrinth of compromise, silence, and calculated cruelty. They show us that the Second World War, often remembered as a clash of absolutes, was riddled with forbidden intersections, where ideology bent beneath the weight of expedience. The NKVD shaking hands with the Gestapo in a ruined capital. The Admiralty gambling lives in a plan scrubbed from official memory. Wall Street profits flowing beneath the smoke of Auschwitz. The Red Army waiting in deliberate silence while Warsaw bled. These fragments, buried under stamps of secrecy, force us to confront an unsettling truth. Victory was never pure. Liberation was never without shadow. And the archives, once sealed in darkness, whisper still of choices that altered the fate of nations, but were too dangerous to acknowledge. As long as these revelations remain contested, suppressed, or dismissed as inconvenient, history itself remains incomplete. The question that lingers, unresolved and haunting, is not only what else lies buried in locked vaults and classified files, but whether we are prepared to face the truths that emerge when the walls of silence finally crack.